So, I want to welcome for the first time a historian to the show on the Archaeological Podcast Network. Hello, Angela.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good.
So, you have a TikTok channel called History with Angela.
Yes.
And
Ancient History with Angela.
There you present different topics from history to the wider public. I think it's in English.
Yes.
But could you maybe tell a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background within history, just so everybody gets a little picture on who you are?
Yep. So basically, I'm studying classics and ancient history. Hopefully, fingers crossed, I've just done my final exam. So as of December, I should be graduated with my degree, bachelor's there. I don't know. I might do honours. I might not. We'll see how it goes. Life's a bit tricky, but that side of things. Then, like you said, I've got a TikTok channel. And the main thing with that was to connect with people about something that I find is enjoyable to talk about, and that not always everybody in your immediate circle might be interested in learning about mythology and all that. And I also like just simplifying it, because I think there's this misconception that, especially with ancient history, it's all just dates and wars and all the boring stuff. But I'm just trying to show that actually maybe it can be simplified and it can be a little bit more interesting than just remembering 500 different dates and emperors. So that's the gist of it.
So would it be fair to say that you're trying to show the other side of history?
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
Because I've been looking at it's more focusing about the women in ancient Rome and Greek that maybe isn't as commonly discussed in the public forums as maybe the Roman generals and the vastness of Roman Empire.
Yeah, definitely. And to be honest, I kind of stumbled on that whole genre almost by accident, because I just took it for granted that people were more aware of these types of things. And then when I started posting about it, like obviously a lot of people are interested in it, but then I was also maybe not shocked, but more like some of the backlash that you get the second that you start discussing something that's not so common. Everybody's very quick to point out, oh, like this isn't 100% accurate, or this can't be 100% proven. Whereas when you go to something that's maybe a bit more widely accepted, that backlash, again, I don't know if that's the right word, but it isn't so common. So that's when I started, well, actually, maybe if I start posting and always try and at least have a couple of sources and stuff in the captions, just to try and say that, hey, just because you might not have heard about this, it doesn't mean that these things don't exist.
What's the thing that you discovered recently that surprised you the most in this type of research?
I think it's how quick people are to discredit, like sometimes I feel like Plutarch is an excellent example. Everybody loves to hate Plutarch. So the second you mention, or Herodotus is my favorite, the second you mention Plutarch or Herodotus, everybody is very quick to say it's Plutarch, it's rubbish, it's Herodotus, it's rubbish. And I think for me it's that narrow viewpoint of just discarding it, whereas I look at it more as it might not be 100% true, but it existed. So somebody all those centuries or thousands of years ago was talking about it. So then why is it suddenly wrong that we are also talking about it now? So the fact that it existed shows that it was kind of in that realm of possibility. So even the one where Sulla's army was marching in, and then the women were lining the rooftops and they're throwing all the bricks down. And people are telling me I've got the wrong emperor. I'm actually talking about like this Greek story. Other people are, of course, saying it's nonsense and all these things. When actually, no, it was quite common that that's something that the women would do. They would take the roof tiles and they would throw them down. It wasn't like this one story and it never happened again. It's just not a tactic. Well, actually, maybe not a tactic that's as well known, not one that is as well spoken about as the men going off and marching into battles. There's a guy I found, he's got this very interesting research paper that he did where he even calculated the velocity of like how much these roof tiles would have weighed, how much it cost per roof tile. So like what they were actually throwing onto the army in a monetary value and in a physical value. Yeah, that was quite good.
So, yeah, roof tiles can be a weapon,
Yeah,
is what we
pretty
learned
much.
here.
Yes. 3 kilos of brick falling on your head probably is going to hurt.
So, are you familiar with Ancient Aliens before I had you watch some selected clips from?
I like trying to tell you, I'm familiar with it, but I struggle to get through an episode because it's annoying, and that's I don't mean to sound mean. It's more like it's frustrating because you want to be like not yell at them, talk to them and be like, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. Can you clarify? And it just gets too, I'm like, never mind. I'll watch something that I know. Game of Thrones, at least, they've made that up and they're clear about it. So yeah, probably haven't watched it to the extent you have.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, it's quite easy to just stand and yell at the television, trying to have a dialogue, but it's not the medium that really gives in.
Works, no. No, the cat's not going to listen.
But you were never into this ancient alien stuff, or had people want to talk about ancient alien things with you when you say, I'm a historian, or come onto your TikTok feeds asking these type of questions?
No, surprisingly enough. Like I said, my biggest conspiracy is that Plutarch existed. So in that sense, oh, actually, well, maybe not so much Atlantis. I remember, and again, not so much on TikTok. It was more when I tried to do YouTube and failed there. But that side of things, so something like Atlantis, and I feel maybe because that's a bit more well known. There, I had some of the conspiracy theories about, I don't even remember now, Athens and aliens and whatever else happened there. So yeah, but that's about the extent. Also, I try not to be controversial, so maybe I just avoid the alien subjects.
But now you're forced, and should we maybe start? So you got a selection of clips.
Yep.
Because, as we all know, ancient aliens have issues trying to stick to one subject and more shotgun it and just go all over the place. But should we start with Pandora and Pandora's jar? How do you feel as an historian? How did you feel about that section?
I felt like they were cherry picking almost the bits and pieces that worked with whatever message they were trying to put across. So, like, for example, the whole muses thing. Like they're like, Hesiod said that he spoke to the muses, and completely ignoring the fact that, I mean, Homer did the same thing. So are you claiming that Homer has also spoken to these aliens and therefore Zeus and everybody else is real? And again, with the muses, particularly because they've really focused on, these muses are these creatures that were brought down to earth. I mean, yes, okay, you could consider that, but I think when you actually study it, the way that the muses were used, particularly when you think that Hesiod was an oral poet, for example, so like they were devices within the text. So yes, it lent authority to what they were saying, but it was a plot device in some instances. Like if they really wanted you to pay attention to something, or if there was something that they wanted to remember, then they evoke the muses. So I feel like they just completely ignore every other possibility, and they're just like, no, definitely it was these creatures, and Hesiod said that he spoke to them, so he meant that literally. He definitely spoke to them. He wasn't just being like, I need some credibility, so I'll say I spoke to some muses. That was my first reaction.
How would you, as a historian, use, for example, Hesiod in your research, or would Hesiod be a source that you would utilize in your historic research, or is it more trying to describe the society he lived in?
Because Hesiod comes in 2 phases, right? So he's got his theogony, which is like the mythology side, and I think from that it is important, and I think it runs parallel to Homer because it's like understanding where the Greek mythology side came from, and it had this huge impact on their lives. So it's good to see the roots there. And then the other one, the Works and Days, which he did, that is more like about the day-to-day lives and the farming and all those types of things. So I think, in my opinion, he's a pretty good primary source in that sense. I mean, he's telling us from his perspective how people lived, and it's a good contrast, I feel, his two works, because it's the beliefs and then it's the day-to-day. So that's, I mean, whenever I look at a myth, how do I put it clearly? When I'm looking at mythology and how it's worked, I always like to go back to the original source to see how it's evolved. So for me, somebody like Hesiod and Homer, I always try to go back to them and see where did it start from, and then where, like when Greek tragedy and all that starts to kick into place, how were these myths then adapted to suit the society at the time? Because obviously they were using them for a bit of a different purpose there. They were trying to make them political, make them get a response out of people. So I feel in that sense, that would be how Hesiod would work for me if I was, yeah, that makes sense.
I think it makes sense to use it in that way, but so they are a product of their time.
Yes.
The muses, they are used by Hesiod, they are used by even philosophers when they trying to tell their philosophy. For example, Socrates were imbuing the muses when he told his Atlantis story, something we have dealt with on this show in the past. Could we see them as a way of saying this is true? Or would it be more of, I'm making this up, but I want you to think it's true?
I think it's a mixture. So from the way that I understand them, is they were using them to boost the authority of the person who was speaking. So be it Socrates, be it Hesiod, they were using it to say, I've got a special relationship with these divine agents, so therefore what I'm saying is true. And there's this whole interesting study as well around, because in Hesiod particularly, the muses actually say that they don't always tell the truth. So it's like, is Hesiod including that point to kind of be like, if I'm wrong about something, it's not because I'm wrong, but it's because I was lied to. But I think because there was also cults and things surrounding the muses as well. So not only, like, it might be unfair to say from our perspective that they were only using it to kind of lend authority to what they were saying and trying to make themselves look better. I think that there is that potential there that it was a religious belief, and that, you know, maybe they did feel like they had spoken to the muses, or that the muses had spoken through them, and that they were kind of passing that on. I think a good comparison is maybe, though, if you look, I just revert back to Homer because he's a bit more easy, but in Homer, because he refers to the muses as well, but he does it with both the muses, where he says, you know, the muses tell me this, but then he also uses Odysseus. So it's never Homer telling you anything. He's always like, either the muses said this, or Odysseus is the one who is telling this story. So I'm not lying about this magical island with like a sorceress. This is just what Odysseus claims to have happened. So maybe when we start looking at things like that, it is like you say, they're just trying to lend authority to their story and trying to make it like I should be listened to, because obviously divine inspiration, or, you know, the muses have given the poet this divine symbol of power and authority, which they're then able to pass on to the common folk.
Yeah, now my main strength isn't ancient Greek literature and things like that, but as far I understand it, for a very long time it was an oral tradition. You weren't really meant to write it down and read it. So would the muses be to give the poet room to change the story as the audience needs for that particular storytelling session? Or would that be a fair assumption? Or is it more extension of the religious idea of the time, maybe?
To be honest, from the way that, like, it seems almost impossible to believe, but from what I understand, they were very good at remembering these ridiculously long like poetry. So yes, of course, it might have changed, and it, like you say, it's a good get out of jail free card because, oh, well, you know, the muses said it. But I think in that instance more, when you look at certain things, and I think I don't speak ancient Greek or read ancient Greek or anything like that, but I think when you look at the way that it's written in some of the key points, when they'll suddenly invoke the muses again, it's almost like a memory device as well. So they know when you get up to this point, then you remember, oh, okay, the muses said this, and then you can kind of stall for time almost. I think That's one of the things that we learnt about when it was in regards to the oral tradition, that some of it was as simple as stalling for time so that the poet could remember where they were up to and then just keep going. Yeah.
So as a historian, when we want to look at the historical sources, what are the challenges when you're going back to the classic sources?
Authenticity. Obviously, we don't have a lot of originals, even the works of Homer, Hesiod and all that. Like, they were written down much later, as you point out, like they were oral traditions. So what we have, it might not even necessarily be the original. And I think a very good example of that is the Pandora myth, which is what they're gibbering on about, because there's this whole thing around the fact that hope was left in the jar, and everybody's like, oh, yeah, that's a very good, clear, defined symbol. But actually, it's more that the way that it's been looked at is that we don't actually have the full myth anymore. So they're not actually sure, was hope even supposed to be left in the jar? Is there like a huge chunk of the story that's missing? Like, we don't quite understand, because it doesn't really make sense, does it? Like, why is hope in the jar? Why didn't hope escape with everything else to go and protect the world? So, like, it's trying to interpret these things which we don't have the full picture for.
Yeah.
And also going back to the muses as well, it's trying to look at it not from our perspective, but from the perspective of somebody who was living in that time. So we can look at it and say, oh, they were using the muses in this way, but for all we know, that's not what they were thinking at all. So those are, the challenges.
And when you want to determine the usefulness of an account, how would you approach that as a historian?
Finding multiple accounts is always a good one. So when you have more than one source telling you something, then at least you can kind of say, okay, well, it most likely did at least happen. And then you can start to look at other perspectives, see where they match, see where they differ, and then also try and find reasons why they would differ, like when was this person writing? And we see that a lot in, the later Roman Empire, when you start looking at all those Roman historians, like what was their own personal bias? How close were they to the original sources? And because another thing, when you look at Plutarch, all these guys, like, we take for granted, if we want to look at something, we just quickly go to Google, or, we can pretty much have that information at our fingertips. But somebody like Plutarch, he would have travelled and he would have gone to libraries, he would have read all these sources, but he wouldn't necessarily have been able to write absolutely everything down. So when he was writing his accounts, and he's saying, I read that blah, blah, blah said this, it's not that he's necessarily intentionally putting forth the wrong information, but he might unintentionally be misremembering something which he did actually cite the primary source for. So that's why it's a good idea, if you can have lots of different sources, you can start to see what are the similarities, what are the differences, and where might they have gone completely wrong. And then later you can also look at that with like archaeological evidence and see, was that city really there? Could we see any other signs and things like that, of course.
What's your biggest challenge as a historian?
Cross-referencing, I think, is the biggest one for me. Because there's this almost paranoia that, like, you find one thing that looks really interesting and then either it's been misrepresented or there's just nothing else to back it up. So you get very excited. You're like, oh, this sounds like a great little gem of information that I've found, but really there's nothing else. And I think what annoys me, I wish I'd had the time to be able to like learn ancient Greek or at least Latin or something like that, because I feel when you can actually read the original text, you're able to get a much clearer, well, not clearer, but you could be more confident that the understanding that you're getting from it is actually closer to what you wanted. So I feel also a good thing to do is also look at different translations. So that's one thing that I always do. So if I'm looking at a source that's been translated, look at different translations and then try and work out, are people interpreting this work differently? Like, yeah.
There's a lot of people out there in the audience who is looking into source criticism and all of that. How do you approach source criticism from a historian perspective?
Obviously finding other points of view or what other people have written on it. So like if you're writing about a topic, it's all well and good to say that's your understanding, but it's making sure that you're getting a broader picture of the academia that's been written or published or produced on what you're trying to understand. So it's not just saying, oh, I'm looking at this coin, and in my opinion, this coin is representative of X, Y, and Z, but it's making sure that what are other people saying on the topic, so that it's not, I don't think it's supposed to be an isolated adventure. Like, you're supposed to be able to do it with your peers, right? You need to see what other people have thought on it, if they've found out things that you don't necessarily know or views that you haven't considered, and that you're not just making things up and saying, well, this is the story that I see and we'll just roll with that.
But Angela, did you know that Alexander the Great encountered UFOs?
Yes, definitely he did. And they scared all his elephants.
Is that a story that you have heard before?
No. Because then I was looking in that one scene where they've got the coin and they zoom in on that one particular part of the coin, and they're like this, like they don't say it, but they're implying that this coin is showing the aliens that scared off the elephants, and that's why Alexander lost the battle. But then the stupid thing is that coin is actually commemorating a battle that he won in India. So they've just like taken a victory and decided that it's a defeat by aliens, and there we go. That's the new narrative. And even if you looked at it, so even if you said, okay, I believe you, aliens exist, but why would you put a loss, like a defeat, on a coin? It doesn't make sense. Like, Alexander was making these coins as propaganda, essentially. And on the other side of the coin, like, you have Nike crowning Alexander. So why would he be going, oh, here, guys, this is the story of the time I lost to aliens? It just doesn't make sense, does it?
Because they were the alien overlord. I don't really understand what they often intend to represent with these narratives, but I think that's part of the issue or lore maybe with ancient aliens, that they put out a lot of this information that you don't really have access to as a normal person, because everything they say sounds quite credible if you just look at it without any deeper insight to it. Have you dealt a lot with Alexander the Great, or is that not really something you bring up during your studies, at least?
No, so a lot of my, and again, mostly personal interest, it's more the mythology side of things and a little bit pre-Alexander the Great. So, but I mean, so even from what you were saying, so like, I'm not 100% familiar with it, but my first instinct is always, well, hang on a second. Let me first find out what battle you're talking about, because they're not even very clear what battle they're talking about. And then as soon as I saw that coin, I'm like, that makes zero sense. Like, why is there a coin that shows his defeat? Even if it's not an alien, there would never be a coin showing a defeat. Like, that's just a waste of resources. And I think that's a very good approach in general to take when you're looking at something. And even if I'm reading something, I'll always be like, hang on, I'm not familiar with that. I would never say it's wrong. I'll say, I'm not familiar with that. Let me make a note and see if I can find some other information to back that up.
Yeah, that's the part, or a key point of ancient aliens or alternative historians in general. They don't want to be specific, because they've learned since the invention of internet, it's a lot easier to, go and look stuff up. That's why they usually just grab certain keywords, put it together, because if you search that sentence, you will get it to the ancient alien narrative, because you won't be able to find the original source that way, which of course is, they don't want you to really learn more. They want to sell you the product of ancient aliens. But history is usually depicted as a very lonesome thing to do, that you're by yourself, researching by yourself, and put out publications by yourself. Is that the current state of history research, or is is it starting to change a little bit?
Yes and no. I feel like for the more, not advanced is the wrong word, but the more in-depth stuff, I feel like it's still a lot more isolated, because just even accessing the information to be able to educate yourself about the more complex issues, it's incredibly hard. Like I'm like, how do you access journal articles if you're not subscribed, if you're not at a university? How do you cross-reference the sources? I mean, a favorite thing people like to say is, oh, just go on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is great because they've got sources on it. But then realistically, how would you check some of those sources if you have no access to them? Those sources could be anything, and half the time they are. But so in that sense, I do feel like it's isolated. But at the same time, I think, and a lot of that is to do with social media and that being able to gain some more interest, it's almost forcing it to become a bit more open, because people are getting interested, people are engaging, and people are realizing, hang on, if I'm able to share my research. And you just look at TikTok, like there's so many like amazingly educated people doing their PhDs, all these things, sharing the information that they're learning, and the engagement that they're getting is humongous. And I feel like that is actually going to start pushing the whole thing into more of a less isolated field, when they realize that actually it doesn't have to be on its own. You don't just have to be your a historian locked up in your study with your quill and ink and writing your own notes. You can actually you can share information, and it doesn't have to be a secret. It doesn't have to be something that you do on your own.
Because a lot of criticisms coming from the ancient alien or alternative history perspective is that there's this hierarchy, and that historians or archaeologists have, these persons sitting deciding on what truth is at the top. And a lot of that originates kind of, among archaeologists, we kind of for a long time have written papers by ourselves, putting it out. More and more we started to work collaboratively as archaeologists start to incorporate a lot of different fields, meaning that you can't know everything yourself. But do you see similar development in historic research, that you're writing journals, articles as a team and not by yourself?
I think so. Obviously, I can't speak from a very experienced point of view, but just from what I've observed, like from my own university and all that, it does seem to be becoming more collaborative. So, even conversations I've had when, I was discussing like the potential of writing a thesis or things like that, like the support of people wanting to be able to work alongside you, and there's not this secrecy like, oh, I've got this idea and I don't want to share it with anybody else, because what happens if they steal my idea and take it out to the world first? I feel like that is, I from my own experience, and again, not nearly as experienced as you, but I feel like there is a bit of a shift that's moving away from that. And I think in the nicest possible way, it's as like the next generation of historians is emerging, that is going to become something that becomes a lot more comfortable, because like people are growing up in a world that's much more accessible, where it's much more like it's normal, like to be chatting, it's normal to be sharing information. So I think that's what's actually going to see that change.
If we look at the state of your field, what do you feel is the biggest challenges from maybe a woman's perspective, being within the classic historic research field?
It's hard for me to answer that, because I know obviously people do experience inequality because of their gender, and I definitely admit that it's out there. But for me personally, I haven't. So I've been incredibly lucky, and I feel, again, that's because of my university, the environment that I've been there. I don't personally have that. The biggest challenge now is actually what I see through social media, is how angry people get when you apparently have this audacity to want to share the achievements of women, which, as we said at the start, aren't necessarily so well publicized. And it's honestly bizarre. And it's not just men. You can't just say that it's men who are like, oh, no, women would never do this. Like, it's coming from women as well, where they're like, oh, this never happened. This is nonsense. Your sources aren't accurate. Whereas it seems to be we need to overcome this perception that just because women traditionally were portrayed in one way, it doesn't make it always right. So I think that's, for me, that's the challenge. It's nothing personal. It's more about sharing information and having people accept that information because that information is about a particular gender. So I feel like when I talk about a male having done something, there's a myth I shared, just to give a story, but about the king who, like, he ended up getting defeated and then he was like, oh, never mind, I'll just let myself burn. So it's a story that's half myth, half potential truth. Not very many angry people about that one. They were like, oh, what a brave man, that's fantastic. Whereas on the other hand, when I share a similar myth about, oh, this woman, she rallied the women together and off they scared all the Spartans, everyone's like, oh, that's stupid. Like, there's no way that would happen. And the Spartans only ran away because, they were like, we wouldn't dare hurt a woman. So, which, is part of the story, but it's just the response. Like, there needs to be a shift in the way that we look at evidence and not be biased or have this preconceived notion that just because it's about a certain gender that it's going to be more true or less true. I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
So do you feel that the public perception about how the ancient world was is a bit, not pseudoscientific maybe, but a misunderstanding of the current research? Or is it the current research haven't really caught up to the public imagination yet?
No, I think it's the perception. And this is just, again, from speaking to people. So it's when we're looking at this historical time through our modern viewpoint. So it's like the whole women were oppressed, then that's just a blanket statement. When actually, from our perspective, definitely that wasn't a good time to be alive. But at the same time, you need to look at it through an individual who's living there, who doesn't know anything about what's going to happen in the year 2000 and something. Because, it was equally unfair for everybody. You look at Athens, for example. So they're like, one of the biggest, or not biggest arguments, but one of the main arguments that comes up is only men were citizens and women, they weren't citizens. And that's taken as like this biggest affront. But actually the term citizen, as we view it, it's not that women were just going to get like put on a boat and kicked out of the country. It was at a different connotation. So, and men, to earn that citizenship, like, they didn't just get given it, they had to go and like be conscripted and live off in the middle of the jungle. There's no jungle, but like go live in the wilderness away from their family. Like, there was all these other hoops that they had to jump through. Men had to participate in politics. So like, imagine if you hated politics, imagine if you hated war, like, bad luck, like, you're a man, you have to go and do that. So I think, like, it sucked for everybody when you're looking at it from a modern perspective. So I feel like there's a misunderstanding, and a lot of the time, I don't want it to be like I'm saying women had the greatest time in the whole wide world. Definitely they didn't. But I feel like we need to look at it not from a modern standpoint. We need to look at it like a contemporary to the time viewpoint. And then maybe we can start understanding a bit more and becoming a bit more accepting that, yes, it looks like women were oppressed, but not oppressed in the way that we view it. So therefore it makes it more possible that maybe women did run businesses or women could have done these other things, because this idea that's been so ingrained in us isn't as accurate as we might have thought.
No, it's fair. Now the next question might not be super fair, but do you think we can use history? But I mean, this is my preconceived notion about history and historians. So it's a bit colored by the archaeological lens there, I can admit. But do you think we can use history to unlock the other side of history? How can we use historical documents that usually focusing on the upper class, as I tend to understand it, to unlock the, everyday person walking the street of Athens or Rome? How would you approach that from the historical documentation that we have accessible?
I think you'd need to sometimes read between the lines. I mean, the first thing that jumps to my mind is there was this gravestone a little while ago that I was reading about. And obviously, like, the more elaborate gravestones and all of that, maybe I'm stepping into archaeology, but anyway, from the Roman Empire. But it was actually dedicated to a slave girl who was a hairdresser. But so obviously the mistress or whoever the girl had been doing the hair and looking after had dedicated this gravestone to this girl. So I feel we need to look through their eyes and see what they were like writing about how do I put it elegantly? Yeah, I don't know how to put it how to put it without rambling. But basically reading between the lines. So when they're talking about like the soldiers, for example, and like it's normally a broad sweeping statement. But if we go to like one of the Alexander, the whole India battle things, like one of the reasons that the India one that Alexander lost is because the soldiers were fed up. They were like, well, no, we're not going to cross the river. Like, we're tired, we're hungry, we've had enough. We just want to go home. And then Alexander was like, oh, okay, fine. So I think that like it's told from Alexander's perspective, but in a way, things like that it's giving us an understanding into how like the influence that the common soldier actually might have had on the way that a military campaign went. There's another really good, a study done on the battle, was it Marathon or something, where, again, we're just giving like this bulk number of like 300,000 men or whatever it was, were on the beaches. And then so they're like, okay, well, realistically, if we take that number, then if we work backwards, how would they have eaten? How would they have gone to the toilet? Like all these things. So like kind of working backwards from there, if they're saying it was this many people, what were the conditions like?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making sense, but...
No, I think I understand that you use the amount and then you work backward from that to see how it could have been. And and then we can add archaeology to see if that's really correct with the reality. Technically, if we're going to have a scientific approach to trying to unlock this issue. And this is maybe a harder question. So you saw 3 segments. We haven't talked too much about them because they were mostly, I don't know, not that fun maybe, but...
They were. I can tell you about Constantine. Nonsense they did there.
Oh, I forgot that Constantine was in there. I didn't take much note on Constantine.
Oh, well, I'll just tell you one quick thing that they did. So in one scene, they're talking about like the Emperor Constantine, the one who like started bringing Christianity into it. And, you know, they're like, oh, he saw the cross. And then they jump and they just conveniently forget that there was another Constantine who came like 300 years later who was attributed to this Greek fire thing, but they just name him Constantine. So they're like, yep, Constantine had this vision of the cross that was aliens, and then Constantine also got given this angel fire. So they literally combined 2 different Constantines together to fit their narrative.
Yeah, I completely missed that. I have to be honest.
It's stupid. That one was probably the worst. And I had to go back and like, I think I watched it like 4 or 5 times. And I'm like, am I understanding what they're saying properly here? Like, are they really trying to claim that these 2 Constantines are the same person? But again, maybe I misunderstood, but that's what it looks like they're doing. So.
No, I remember that they talked about the Constantine with the crosses in the sky, who, introduced Christianity to the Roman Empire, is usually depicted. I'm not sure how correct that really is or how truthful he was about his conviction, but that's another discussion. But they never claim that there's 2 Constantine. They only refer to as this Constantine in the episode, actually.
Yeah. So the Christian one is like 300 AD, and then the Greek fire or the angel fire that they talk about, he comes in like to play. I think the first time that's recorded is in 600 AD. So literally 300 years, is that 300? Yeah, that's 300 years. 300 years apart between these 2. They're like, no, Constantine had a vision, and then as a present, because he had this vision, they just gave him some magical fire to keep fighting the demon overlords or whatever it is they're fighting.
Yeah, they like to have evil aliens for some reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. I did not catch that. But again, that's really show how much you have to know to really be able to catch what they are doing, because it's not something your everyday person would be able to catch, really, if you don't have a very strong interest in this type of research, which make it so credulous.
I think also it's not even necessarily a strong interest. I feel the fact that the way it's presented, because is it on the History Channel? Is that wherever it's?
Yeah, it's on the History Channel again. Yeah.
Yeah, so people, I feel, when they watch it, they might be watching it with a genuine interest, but the fact, like, one, it's on this channel called the History Channel. Two, it's like it's on TV and it's got this big production value that they like. It's a naivety in thinking that something like that surely must be telling the truth. Like, there's no way the History Channel would lie to me. So it's a bit unfair.
And then that they also mix these, because they usually tend to get one or two that have a credential, not necessarily always in what they're talking about, but they usually have PhDs that's smart mixed in with these other alienists, as I call them.
Yeah, they had the radio host.
Yeah, the radio
just a
host.
Random radio host talking about sulfur blowing up.
Yeah, he's famous. He hosts the Coast to Coast AM in US, which is a very famous alien, spooky, supernatural radio show. So he talks
which is sorry, cut you off.
No, so Nori talks a lot with the different experts within the field of supernatural, and therefore he's supposed to be an expert in the supernatural and alien beings. But yeah, he's just a random guy having a radio show, just like Joe Rogan and the others, basically, but he don't have any expert. But then you have him side by side with someone with a PhD who might be talking about their subject. Because that happens that the ancient aliens manage to find someone who might think they are going to do a, two sides of the story kind of thing, and then just edit around the stuff that don't fit. And then they have people with PhD that just believe in the ancient aliens idea, who might be speaking on, the archaeology of ancient Egypt, but have their PhD in medieval literature. They don't really, just because you have a PhD doesn't mean that you know everything about everything. It usually means that you know something very specific about a very limited area. But so that's why they like the title in the show, as you might have noticed if you paid attention to what happened down there.
Yeah, it's bizarre. But also, I got the sense, because when the astrologer was talking, I feel like he was just generally talking about science. Like, I feel like he wasn't necessarily talking about aliens, and they're just like, yep, see, we've got an astrologer. He's talking about this stuff. It's definitely,
but that's
definitely true.
Many who appeared on the show as expert who wasn't part of the, alien sphere usually did so sometimes with false pretenses. They weren't really honest in what they were doing, and then they talk, and then they just grab the soundbite that fits the narrative that they want, and then just, now we have our expert saying that aliens could be real, and that's great.
Yeah, which is unfair in itself, isn't it? Because it's,
I mean, it's editing you out of context, basically, which is never a good thing. But
and also then harming their reputation.
Yeah, luckily nobody seems to have suffered too much yet, but you never know. There's many who, especially those who appeared in the first season, when they actually were a bit trick people to appear on them, because they were told that we're going to do a science versus aliens. And then they just
I had no idea.
Aliens are real type of things, and just edited the expert out. Some experts appear later in second season, and then just realize that no matter how they talk or what they say, they will be edited out of context, and then just stop appearing on it. Let's put it like this. Did you learn something from the ancient alien that you've watched?
How to screenshot a coin and double check it's the right. I honestly, I think for me it's just the affirmation that you can't believe really anything that's online, or at least double check. And I think even if it's not ancient aliens, it's a good way to approach life. If you hear something, just accept it. And then do your own research and just double check that what you've heard is right. Yeah, no, I learned about angel fire. That was great. And a few aliens, and elephants don't like aliens. Let that. Yep, no. That's about the best message I got from that.
So if people want to hear more from you, where should they go in that case?
So I'm on TikTok under either the handle thing is boring history, because of course that's all I talk about is boring history. Otherwise, I think if you look up ancient history with Angela, then I should come up as well. Thank you for having me. It's been fun. So hopefully
Thank you
I haven't rambled too much.
Thank you for coming on.